Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. In this video, we're going to talk about adapting to a meta in DDO. So this generally means, should you adapt your build to the current state of balance in the game? Should you go after builds that are particularly powerful and avoid builds that are particularly weak? Should you go after classes that are particularly powerful and avoid classes that are particularly weak? So we're going to go through that idea, talk about a few things, give the pros and cons of each, and just come up with a conclusion. A lot of the time, the best builds in the game are often called flavor of the month builds. You see that a lot as a common term. And what is the top level or top tier builds / classes in the game is constantly changing throughout the history of DDO. Many different classes, many different builds have been classified as quote unquote the best in this game. Although, of course, in this game not being a PvP game, well, I know we have PvP, but it's not a PvP focused game. Whether or not the meta is important is up for debate. Because in a game like, say, a fighting game, obviously the meta is important because you're playing against other players. But in a game like this, where you are not, is the meta important? Are these types of stronger classes something you should be going after? The best builds in the game are always changing because the developers are constantly reevaluating balance. They've told us this many times, that balance is an ongoing thing and they're always going to reevaluate balance. They want all the classes to stay on a level playing field, contrary to, say, like pen and paper, which I think in many ways I don't know a lot about pen and paper, but I've been told that casters are particularly powerful in pen and paper and that balance isn't as big of a thing. But in DDO, being a kind of game where we want everyone to feel like they're contributing, and we don't want anyone to kind of take away another person's fun, balance can be seen as important, and it definitely is something that developers have taken pride to, because there's a lot of people who have personal preferences for classes and they want to make sure those players at least feel competitive. So when it comes to the best builds in the game, or the quote-unquote flavor of the month builds, I think these types of builds are more often utilized by your regular players. So you're not your casual players. They're definitely more often utilized by your regular players, your everyday players. And that's partially because regular players have more knowledge, but also partially because these players can adapt to changes a lot quicker because they play more often. So they're constantly reincarnating, constantly getting their character to cap, constantly have the ability to change their class. Now, a lot of, say, casual players may only play a couple hours a week, so it may take them months and months and months just to get one character up to cap. So unless they want to start dumping money into reincarnating into hearts from the store, they're probably not going to want to change their reel too often. And just because of their approach to the game in general, they probably don't care quite as much what the meta is. And I think a lot of regular players use these builds for a variety of reasons. I mean, of course, the prime one being they enjoy just being the most powerful and being able to really get through content. And partially because that's just fun. It's always fun to be powerful. But also it lets you grind more efficiently. So if you're grinding for, say, loot at endgame, or you're grinding through past lives, often playing the more powerful builds to do that process. Say you want to go after a racial past life, if you pick the most powerful class, it's obviously going to make that process more efficient. A more powerful class is going to be able to level faster so they can reach their end goal of getting those past lives more quickly. And a lot of folks have the mindset, which is not a wrong one. I'm not criticizing here at all. But they have the mindset that winning DDO equals being the most powerful, and that's totally fine. That's totally a legitimate way of viewing the game and viewing your end goal for the game. So to these folks, these top builds are more attractive just because they're naturally competitive, and they naturally want to be the best in the group or the best in the game. These types of players want to solo the Reaper 5, all that stuff, like higher level Reapers with their build. They want to really do this really difficult content. And oftentimes they say they have friends and guildmates, and they have goals for their guild or for their static group, and say they want to get through certain content, get through certain raids on higher difficulty levels, and they want to help bring their friends through that. So they go for the more powerful builds for that reason. And that's a very legitimate reason to want to go after these builds. There's a lot of other upsides. I mean, the biggest one being is you know that you're the best class, at least for now. You know that you're playing the most efficiently. As I've already mentioned, you can more easily run through higher difficulties with these top builds, the meta-leading builds. And in some content, like Reaper content, you could argue with the higher Reaper, your Reaper like 9 and 10, you can argue that these types of builds may even be required to complete certain content at the highest difficulty settings. Okay, now that we talked about some of the upsides, let's go ahead and talk about some of the downsides. There's a lot of volatility with going after a high meta build. The reason there's a lot of volatility is because patches happen in the game, and that can have the ability to either badly hurt your build or at least somewhat hurt your build, at least the way you see it, or it can make another build surpass your build by them getting a buff. Now, to the developers' credit, I think they've been very conservative for the most part when doing nerfs, but nerfs do happen from time to time, and sometimes there's a particularly very powerful ability that or class or something that needs to be nerfed, and they have to do that in order to get balance, because the reason they have to nerf is because a lot of the times it's much easier to nerf one build rather than buff every other build. It just takes a lot less time, and the problem with buffing everyone else and not nerfing the one class that's leading in power is because that makes all the content in the game easier effectively, and you're introducing power creep. So that can be a problem. But if you are running what you know are the best builds in the game, you know you're prone to those patches. You never really know if in the next patch they're going to take away that ability, that overperforming ability that you may be taking advantage of. And because there's constant changes, because you look throughout the game, the best builds have constantly been changing. You're going to have to make regular build changes. So if you're a regular player, as I mentioned before, this might not be a big deal. But if you're not as much a regular player, you might log in, say, take a month off, log back in, and find out that your build is no longer the best. Another downside is it may be boring to run with your more average players. Now, some people really like carrying people through dungeons, but others may just find it boring that they have to, say, play on a certain difficulty they feel is not challenging enough for them, or they don't like that their teammates or the people in their group aren't really carrying their weight as much as they might see it. So they might not be able to, a lot of people aren't going to be able to perform up to the standards of your build, so that could be boring. I think these types of builds also have more gearing requirements simply because, no, it's not the, let me reword that. It's not the build itself that has more building requirements. The best builds aren't going to typically require more stuff, but you're going to have to change your build constantly. So that means that, say, if the best build in the game's a necrocaster, a lot of the necro casting gear you farm out is going to be useless if the next best build in the game is like a blitzing melee, and you want to switch to that. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to use that necro gear on that build, so you might have to farm out a lot more gear. I also think that there's a lot of frustration that can come around from running a quote-unquote best build or a flavor of the month build, because I think a lot of players get used to it and they really like the way their build functions when they're using it. And when the developers change that, it can be really frustrating, because as you've used that build, you've gotten used to it, you kind of feel entitled to the way it functions currently. But when it gets changed, it's not going to function that way potentially. So that can be a real problem. And that's partially the developer's fault, because sometimes they leave holes that really open themselves up to being exploited by certain builds, or certain abilities are overperforming that the developers didn't balance right the first time. But at the same time, it's also partially the player's fault, because you're knowingly taking advantage of things that are obviously not working as intended sometimes, now depending on the build, of course. So if you're doing that, you're setting yourself up for disappointment from the get-go. So let's talk about the solution, or the kind of conclusions to this topic. I've never been one, as you can tell because I've run clerics, who's ever gone after the quote-unquote best builds in the game, just because this is a player versus enemy game, not a player versus player game. So I don't see as much of a point in running the best build. I see a lot more fun to just have a build that's viable and can contribute. So I always say that you should play the build in class that you like the most, no matter its power levels. That way you have no variance, because your enjoyment of the game is not dependent on the power level of your build. Your enjoyment of the game is dependent on yourself only. It's only dependent on you playing the class you like the most. So no matter where it stands in the meta, you're always going to have fun with the game. You're not going to put time into a build, have the meta change, and then get upset because your enjoyment of the game was tied to your build's power level, and that's no longer there because, say, another class was buffed or your class that you were using was nerfed. Putting time into a flavor of the month build is, I think, generally a bad investment because it's going to change in the future, and you know that. The reason people min-max in other types of games, say like League of Legends or say any kind of fighting game, is because it makes sense to keep up with the meta, because the end goal of the game is to beat other players. That's the main focus. That's what you're building for. That's what you're gearing. So in a game like DDO, where the tangible rewards of loot and experience are only very small in running the highest difficulties like Reaper, as opposed to a slightly lower difficulty like Epic Elite, since the reward is only very minor and there's almost no emphasis on player versus player, I find there to not be enough reason to min-max to the most extent. That's why in this game, in contrast to many other games I play, I don't min-max to the most extent. I focus on the build I enjoy the most and go with that almost always. For me in DDO, enjoyment is by far the most important factor when I choose a build. So guys, that's my opinion on the topic. I'm sure some of you will disagree. Some of you will probably agree. But comment below, let me know. And that's going to be it for today. Hope you all enjoyed. Have a good one. Take care.